I don't do a lot of Quebec politics talk on this show for a couple of reasons. I think the general one is that it is its own animal, the politics of Quebec, and in a way that isn't always directly analogous to the politics, or isn't really ever directly analogous to the politics outside of Quebec. This election, I was making a little bit more of an effort to stay apprised of what was happening because of the emergence of the Quebec Conservative Party. But as we saw, and I mean, as we kind of feared, it didn't really make a difference. On the popular vote, the Parti conservateur de Quebec had just under 13% of the vote, which is quite significant, but that amounts to 0 seats. You take that and compare it, say, to the Parti québécois, 14.6% of the vote, 3 seats, or Quebec Solidaire, 15.4% with 11 seats. The Liberals even, 14.37%, and they got 21 seats. So distribution is everything in first past the post. So all of these parties that weren't the CAQ basically had a similar enough vote share, but for the Conservatives, it was too heavily centralized in a couple of key strongholds. But nevertheless, Éric Duhaime is staying on board and will continue to lead the party. And it really is, I mean, apart from the Liberals, which are liberal, the only party speaking up for English language rights in Quebec, and I think in general for a form of conservatism that isn't rooted in Quebec separatism. But I want to take a different look at this thing and talk about François Legault, who has 90 seats now under this. 90 seats, 40% of the vote. This is a supermajority. And if we go back just a year and a bit, François Legault was the guy presiding over the strictest COVID regime in Canada. This was a guy who was threatening to tax the unvaccinated, to fine the unvaccinated, a guy who banned the unvaccinated from shopping in big box stores. Remember this photo that went around, I think it was of a Walmart, where the unvaccinated had to wait in this little vestibule like some dirty animal under quarantine while someone else went and got their stuff for them because they weren't allowed to buy non-essential things. That's what François Legault did. Or people that were harassed and fined for walking outside their homes after, I think it was 8 p.m. at one point and then 10 p.m. But the guy who put in place a COVID curfew. So Quebec presides over the most restrictive COVID measures in North America and in some respects the world. And he gets a supermajority. You go back to the last Ontario election, less than a couple of months ago. Very similar thing. Doug Ford, very strict COVID protocols in this country. Ontario had the vaccine passports. Ontario had the lockdowns. Ontario had the stay-at-home order. Ontario had, for a time, the granting to police the right to question people who were out of their homes. And Doug Ford gets handily reelected with another majority. Doug Ford, elected after putting in COVID restrictions, elected after taking people's freedoms. François Legault, elected after taking people's freedoms. Justin Trudeau, and he's a bit of a different case, as we've talked about on the show. In the last federal election, just over 1 year ago, he was trying to push more restrictions. He was arguing for more restrictions. I want to ban the unvaccinated from the public service. I want to keep the unvaccinated off planes. I want to separate these dirty, racist, misogynist, unvaccinated types. And he wins. Not a majority, but he wins. So there's a question in all of this that must be asked. Do people like lockdowns? Do people like politicians who lock them down and take away their liberties? I don't think the answer is yes, but I also don't think the answer is no. I think that the sad reality is that this issue is not a deal breaker. And I'll give you 2 fundamental reasons why I think that is. The first is that when people feel they have no legitimate alternative, their vote choice becomes this thing that they just do. So the federal election in 2021 is a great example of this. All 5 party leaders came together after the one debate, I think it was actually before the French debate, and they recorded this PSA.
We're all in this together.
We've come so far in the fight against COVID, it's time to finish this pandemic for good. So get vaccinated. If you know someone who hasn't, talk to them. For our kids, for our communities, for our economy. It's how we get forward together.
Vaccines are safe and effective for use. Vaccines are the best way for you to protect yourself, your family, and your community. So get vaccinated. Let's fight COVID-19 together.
Pour vous protéger vous-même, pour protéger les plus fragiles d'entre nous, pour protéger l'ensemble de la population, le meilleur moyen connu demeure le vaccin. S'il vous plaît, soyez responsables, soyez solidaires, faites-vous vacciner. Merci.
We all agree getting vaccinated is the way forward. We're all in agreement this is not a partisan issue, so please get vaccinated.
We're united, and it's time to get the shot. Vaccines save lives, they're how we're going to beat COVID, and it's time for everyone to do it. Get the shot.
Get the shot.
Now, you may think, what's the big deal? 5-party leaders, a couple of them have now been deposed, but nevertheless, 5-party leaders come up and say everyone should get vaccinated. Well, it means that it didn't really look like there was anyone else speaking up for people that said, well, maybe I'm okay with the vaccine, but I'm not okay with this coercion. I'm not okay with the mandates. I'm not okay with firing people. That Team Canada approach just completely made it look like there was no daylight between the Liberals and the Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois and the Greens and the NDP, at least on the COVID file. Now, obviously, you fast forward now, and the Conservative position is much different and much better than it was back then. But at the time, only Maxime Bernier and the People's Party of Canada, who, as we know, weren't in the debate and didn't have seats in Parliament and still don't have seats in Parliament, but only they were talking about this issue from what I would just broadly characterize as the libertarian perspective. So I think this is important. If you're a voter in Ontario, say, and you're saying, well, I normally lean conservative, but I really don't like those lockdowns that Doug Ford did. Yeah, I can vote for the Ontario Party, but they're not going to win a seat. I can vote for New Blue. They're not going to win a seat. And then I'm stuck with the Liberal or the NDP, who would have locked me down just as much. And I talked to a lot of people like that. Now, many of them ended up staying home, but a lot of them just said, yeah, okay, fine, I guess I'll vote Conservative because it doesn't really matter. There's just this resignation that this is the way politics is, and there isn't really another option. And in Quebec, very similar. Now, obviously, you throw the language divide in and other ideological fault lines in Quebec, but a lot of people that felt, yeah, well, that's it. We were going to get locked down no matter what. There really isn't a non-lockdown candidate. So we just accept and unnecessarily settle because we don't believe, and in many cases rightfully so, that there are other options, that there are better options.